Let's go back to the table of contents. Now that we know just a little bit about the history behind the book, and you have some handout sheets which have been given to you, and we've made up a few sheets as we go along to just kind of illustrate what we're talking about at a particular time. And we've talked about the fact that Bill had to know three things before he could recover, and Dr. Bob already knew two of them, and Bill took one of them to him, and then both of them took all three of them to Bill Dotson. And we began to study the book one time looking for these three things. And we kind of set in our mind what we call goals, things that we're trying to achieve. And we decided to take the big book and see if maybe it was written in the same sequence that it was necessary for those guys to know in order to recover. And sure enough, as we begin to look into the book, we find that it really is written in about that same sequence. The first goal is to find out what the problem is. Most alcoholics today have no idea what the problem is. In fact, we people in AA are the only alcoholics that know what the problem is. All those people out there still drinking, they don't know what's wrong with them. They don't even know they're alcoholic, much less know what alcoholism is. And the first thing we're going to have to find out to recover, not only from alcoholism, but any problem, is what is the problem. You know, today we got many, many health problems in the United States, and we're spending literally millions and millions of dollars on them. And normally they say we're trying to find a cure for them. But in many cases, we're trying to find out what it is. And if we can ever discover what an illness is, then we can usually find a cure or a solution for that. Nobody ever knew what alcoholism was until the 1930s. And Dr. Silkworth began to talk about these things to Bill Wilson. And that information carried on into the book. So the first thing we're going to try to find out, the first goal we're going to set for ourselves is, what is the problem? Now, after you once see the problem, then the solution is quite simple. So the second goal we'll set for ourselves is to see what the solution really is. And then after you see the solution, then we need to know a program of action in order to be able to find that solution. For instance, let's say you were sitting at home in your house this evening, and it began to rain outside like it did a while ago, and you look up and you see water dripping out of the ceiling. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is you've got a problem, and the problem is you've got a leaking roof. No, that's not really the problem. The problem is, where does that sucker leak? It can be leaking through a shingle. It could be leaking through a valley. It could be leaking around the fireplace. You can't determine a solution until you find out what the problem is. When you once identify the leak, then you can determine a solution. It will be a different solution for a different kind of leak. And after you determine the solution, then you can determine a program of action, and then you can solve your problem. Simple way to solve problems that we've always used. The same thing works on alcoholism. Let's look at the three parts of the book and see the problem, the solution, and the program of recovery or program of action.
You know, this big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is written pretty much the way Bill received this information that we're going to receive. You know, for instance, he received the doctor's opinion from Dr. Silkworth, and then he tells his story in chapter 1. And then he was brought a solution, we know that. And it wasn't, and that's chapter 2. And it wasn't a solution that he liked. And so he needed to tell us more about alcoholism. He needed to know more about alcoholism, more understanding about alcoholism, because he didn't like the solution. Then he knew he was going to have trouble with the solution, so he wrote a chapter called We Agnostics, the same as he had trouble with that solution. So he wrote us a chapter called We Agnostics. And then the action necessary for recovery, in chapter 5, he wrote how it works, how to find the solution. In chapter 6, he wrote another chapter called Into Action. Now that's not into thinking, it's into action. And then in chapter 7, after we've had this solution happen to us, he tells us how we can take this same solution and to work with others with it. See, I didn't know that when I first came into Alcoholics Anonymous, because I was so scatterbrained. I'd read a few stories in the back of the book, and I'd read a little bit in the front of the book, and I'd read some in the middle of the book, and I just didn't read the book in any particular manner. See, I'm in the printing business, And I have been involved in the designing of books, and I know a bit about the anatomy of a book. But it never dawned on me that this book was written in any particular manner. Because after all, a bunch of alcoholics wrote it, and what would they know about a book? You know, that's the question I asked. But I found they had a lot of help with this book. This book is written precisely and exactly, one chapter to another, one chapter explaining to you, leading to the next, and the next, and the next, all the way through the book. That's why I need to start in the front of the book, by the way. Not in the middle or the back, but in the front.
We'll find that because of our physical allergy to alcohol, because of our mental obsession of the mind, we've become absolutely powerless over alcohol, and our lives have become unmanageable. Now, the information necessary to show us that, we're going to find basically in the doctor's opinion and in Bill's story. We see a little of it, chapter 2 and 3, but most of it in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. And if we can see that information, and we can accept it in our lives, then we have reached goal 1. What is the problem? The problem is we are powerless over alcohol. Step 1 is a problem statement. Now, if we are powerless over alcohol, then obviously the answer would lie within power. And we find that they can do nothing about the allergy of the body. So the only hope of our recovery is working on the mental obsession of the mind. So we're going to find the answer to the powerless condition is power working in the mind. And through chapter 2, there is a solution. Chapter 3, more about alcoholism. Chapter 4, we agnostics. We'll be able to see the information necessary to reach goal 2, and we'll be able to come to believe that there is a power greater than we are that can restore us to sanity. Now, if the problem is powerless, and if the answer is power, then obviously the only other thing we need to know is how do you find that power? And we'll find that little program of action outlined in chapters 5, 6, and 7, which will be the last 10 steps, 3 through 12. And the result is we'll have a spiritual awakening, and we'll no longer be powerless over alcohol. So the big book is written in exactly the same sequence that they had to know it, to point out these 3 goals: problem, solution, and how do you find that solution. And as we go through these chapters, we'll be talking about these 3 things all the way throughout the weekend. Let's now go over to the preface of the book and look at the second paragraph on Roman numeral 11.
It's because this book has become the basic text of our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for both the second and the third edition. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor. He said this is a basic text of our society. It's a textbook. You know, I always had an aversion to textbooks. Every time I ever saw a textbook, it reminded me when I was in school, and the textbook reminded me to cheat a lot. So I didn't know this was a textbook. And a textbook in its simplest form is simply the transference of information through the written, from the mind of one alcoholic, through the written word to the mind of the other, increasing the knowledge of the reader and the user of the book. That's all a textbook is for. And that's precisely what this book is for. They're trying to transfer information from their minds through the written word to me, so that it would help me to understand the program that they're trying to describe to me. And I need to know certain words, and as we go through the book, we're going to pick out certain words that are important to know and understand how they were trying to write to us and some of the things they were trying to tell us as they were going through this textbook.
Many people in AA have an aversion to the very idea of a textbook because they remember textbooks back in school. And they remember studying and taking tests and all the trouble we had to go to. And they simply don't like that idea. But if you look at a textbook in its simplest form, all in the world it is a way to take information from the mind of one human being, put it down in a written form, transfer it to the mind of another human being that is using the book. That's all a textbook is for. And by the way, that's all teaching is too. You hear people in AA today say you can't teach. I don't know why you can't. Teaching is nothing more than transference of information from one mind to another, increasing the knowledge of the one that's being taught. We all teach somebody something every day, and we're all being taught something every day. A textbook is simply a tool used for that transference. Textbook will nearly always assume that the reader of the subject matter will know very little about it. Normally starts at a very simple level. And as the knowledge of the reader increases, the information presented becomes more difficult. Let's take a textbook on mathematics. Let's say that my friend Joe here knows nothing at all about mathematics. He can't add, he can't subtract, he can't do any of those things. Oh, he can count all right. In fact, he could probably count to 21 if he's standing there naked and got everything where it ought to be.
20 and a half, actually.
Well, he's coming up in this world. Last time he said 20 and a quarter.
I'm bragging.
And I walk up to Joe and I say, Joe, I've got a textbook on mathematics. I want you to go to chapter 5 and do the algebra problems. Well, being a good fellow, he'll go to chapter 5, but he can't even add and subtract, much less do algebra. Just looks like a bunch of marks on paper to him. If I say, Joe, chapter 1 deals with the value of numbers, addition and subtraction. If you'll read it, study it, ask questions, let me help you. By the time you're through with chapter 1, you'll know how to add and subtract. And sure enough, he learns that. And then I can say, now, based on what you've learned in 1, you can now go to chapter 2 and learn how to multiply and divide, and he does that. And then we can take him to chapter 3 and we can teach him fractions and decimals. And we can gradually prepare his mind so when he gets to chapter 5, he'll be able to learn how to do algebra problems. Probably one of the greatest mistakes in AA today. Newcomer comes in the door, we hand them the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, we say go to chapter 5 and do what it says and you'll be all right. And they go to chapter 5, they open it up, they read how it works, and they immediately run into a bunch of algebra problems. Step 1 said we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, our lives had become unmanageable. The newcomer said, I'm not powerless over anything. They have no idea what we mean by that statement. Step 2 said, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Newcomer said, man, don't tell me I'm crazy. Oh, yeah, I do stupid things when drunk, but when I'm sober, I'm like other people. They have no idea what we mean by that statement. Well, if you're not powerless and you're not nuts, then you don't need to worry about turning your will over and your life over to the care of something you don't understand in the first place. And we present them with an impossible situation. If we can do nothing else all weekend, I hope we'll be able to see the value of the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters and how they dovetail into this thing in perfect sequence, giving us the information to prepare our minds for chapter 5. You see, chapter 5 starts with step 3. And it's kind of hard to start with 3 unless you got 1 and 2 behind you already. Hopefully we'll be able to see that. The other thing that is so important, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. You know, the first edition came out in 1939. And the stories in the back of the book, which were there partially for the newcomer to find themselves in, they were no longer accurately reflecting the membership of AA. By 55, age had come down, bottom had come up, more and more women coming into AA. And they said, we need to change some of those stories. So they dropped some stories, added some more in, came out with the second edition of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, but they left the recovery section the same. Same thing happened in 1976. Changed stories in the back of the book, came out with the third edition, but they left the recovery section exactly the same. Why? Probably because it works just as good today as it did back in 1939. Why? I think for 3 reasons. 1, alcoholics don't change. You know, they're the same today as they were in 1939. They're getting in cars and having car wrecks. They're getting in knife fights, divorce courts. They're getting in hospitals. They're getting in jailhouses. All the fun things we alcoholics do, we're doing it today just like they did in 39. Alcohol hasn't changed. All the name changes, the color changes, the bottles change, but alcohol's the same. Human nature never changes. It's the same today that it was 2,000 years ago. Well, if those 3 things haven't changed, then there's no need to change the recovery program. It works just as good today as it did in 1939. So I think 2 things are very important. First is, it is a textbook. written as a textbook. Second, it's never been changed since it appeared in 1939, and I think that's the next great miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. God, you know how we love to change things. Every one of us that's ever read this book has rewritten it in our minds 2 or 3 times, but collectively we've never found it necessary to change our program yet. I think that's a real miracle. Joe?
Let's go to the forward of the first edition, and after we do this, we'll probably take a break. It said we, and I think that's the biggest word in Alcoholics Anonymous is we. I got sober on the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. We can do what I cannot do. If I could have done it, I'd have never come here, so I had to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. It said we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. They're beginning to tell us what the problem really is. A seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, 2 different things. And a little bit later on, we're going to separate those two, the mind from the body, and go into those in great detail. It's important that I understood those things anyhow. And it says to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. And when you see anything in this book, it's in italic. Charlie calls it squiggly writing. I call it italics. It's really italics. It's not squiggly writing. But when you see anything here in italics, it's extremely important. It bears reading again. And it says to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. And later on in the book, in some more of this writing, it says specifically, exactly, with clear-cut directions. So this is a book that's not on just about how to recover from alcoholism. This is a book on how to recover precisely, specifically, exactly, with clear-cut directions on how to recover from alcoholism.
You know, most books I read have been authored by one person. And usually when I read a book authored by one person, if I see something in there I don't agree with it, my keen intellectual alcoholic mind usually says, who in the hell are they to think they're smarter than I am? And I just ignore that. But if I do that with a big book, I've got to realize I'm not arguing with one, I'll be arguing with 100. Started out as 40 and 37, but they had 100 by the time the book was published. And it's much more difficult for me to argue with 100 people than it is one, especially if they have recovered from the same thing as killing me as a practicing alcoholic, a hopeless condition of the body and mind known as alcoholism. And that brings up the word recovered. I hear people today say, can you really recover from alcoholism? Well, I hope we can. If we can't, we're in bad shape. I'll never be cured of alcoholism. I will always be physically allergic to alcohol. I'll never be able to safely drink alcohol again. But I'll tell you something. Before I came to AA, not only could I not drink alcohol, I couldn't keep from drinking alcohol, and I lived in a hopeless condition of the mind and body known as alcoholism. Well, today I still can't drink alcohol. But through this fellowship and this program, I no longer have to drink alcohol. And I don't live in that hopeless condition of the mind and body known as alcoholism. I'll always be alcoholic, but I've recovered from alcoholism. And we're going to see that word recovered all the way through this book. Now, Joe and I have been around AA long enough to know and fully understand that you can't make anybody in AA do anything they don't want to do. The only requirement for membership in AA is a desire to stop drinking. And you can come to an AA meeting, you can stand up in the middle of the meeting and say, I don't like you suckers at all. And I almost vomit when I read you 12 steps. And I can barely drink your lousy old coffee. But I'm going to be a member of AA because I've got a desire to stay sober. And nobody can say a word about that. In fact, you don't even have to be sober to be a member of AA. It helps if you are, but you really don't have to be a member of AA. Now that deals with membership in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Our book doesn't deal with that at all. Our book deals with one thing and one thing only. Recovery from a hopeless condition of the mind and body known as alcoholism. And the purpose of this book is to show others precisely, specifically, exactly, with clear-cut directions as to how the first 100 recovered from alcoholism. And those of us that wish to follow that procedure, I think we can expect to get exactly what they got, recovery from that condition known as alcoholism. Now, we're not talking about sobriety. Anybody can get sober. Any idiot can get sober. You walk up to a policeman and slap the hell out of him, and I'll guarantee you're going to get sober. The question is, how do you get sober, stay sober, and be happy with that condition? That's recovery. So we're not talking about sobriety, we're talking about recovery. Now we're going to take about a 15-minute break, then we'll do the doctor's opinion.